On Wednesday, Senate Republicans held hearings in which they drilled Dr. Anthony Fauci about his handling of the COVID pandemic. If you caught any of these hearings, you know that they were tense, angry hearings with Paul and other Republican senators laying into Fauci.
The committee will have to consider, after this hearing, what appropriate action should be taken against you for the failure to testify after being directed to do so. It's against the law to obstruct an investigation of Congress. There will be repercussions to your refusal to testify today.
Here I am sitting in front of you 6 years later saying, who the fuck do you think you were for doing that? It is a total disgrace what you did to this country. And if my Democrat colleagues are standing there defending you, I hope the voters of the United States of America watch the clips of every one of you doting on a guy who was more interested in being a celebrity than saving American people.
And Fauci repeatedly utilizing his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination.
Although it pains me to do so, because of the respect I have for the legislative branch of government and my decades-long record of cooperating with Congress, under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions.
Now, I should say from the outset that I have no particular feelings about Fauci. He's a dedicated public servant. He's made mistakes. He's had big successes. And I think his role during the COVID pandemic, especially in those first few months, was to provide leadership that wasn't coming from the federal government. You may not remember, but I certainly remember.
You see, Pepperidge Farm remembers
That Donald Trump effectively abdicated all political leadership during the pandemic. First of all, apparently a lot of Americans don't remember that Donald Trump was president during COVID or during the first year of it. And second of all, again, he abdicated all real responsibility for leading the country. Those press conferences where Trump offered bizarre solutions to the pandemic, including potentially injecting oneself with bleach.
And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute, 1 minute. And is there a way we can do something like that by injection inside or almost a cleaning?
Weren't just funny sideshows, but represented a government that was completely over its head when it came to a pressing crisis. A crisis that in the end killed more than 1 million Americans. Fauci showed real leadership when there wasn't very much coming from Washington. And while he was not perfect, he and the other public servants at the Centers for Disease Control worked very hard to try to save as many American lives as possible. And so for my part, these hearings are honestly kind of despicable. They're less about any actual malfeasance and more about a set of conspiracy theories that have become something like a shibboleth among Republicans, a way for them to deal with the fact that their party and their leader shit the bed on the pandemic. One does not have to contend with the profound failures of the Trump administration in 2020 when one can pretend instead that Fauci was at the head of a broad conspiracy hiding the true origins of the COVID pandemic. And although there are plenty of commentators who will insist to you that there's a secret, hidden conspiracy trying to prevent you from learning about the true origins of the pandemic, a lab leak, the fact of the matter is that there's been a lot of investigation done of this, a lot of study, and they've all come to the same conclusion that COVID was naturally occurring. It was random. And I do think that a lot of people reject the randomness of something like that, reject the idea that our lives could be turned completely upside down over essentially something that happened by chance. I think it scares people, it frightens them, and they'd rather hold on to some kind of explanation, especially an explanation that flatters one's sense of intellect and intelligence and knowledge. My views of all of this aside, here's the thing. That was 5 years ago, 6 years ago, right? It's been half a decade, maybe a little more, since Fauci was a prominent figure in American life. We had a whole other presidency. And the 2024 election wasn't fought over getting to the bottom of the pandemic. The 2024 election was fought over inflation and the price of goods and the cost of living. And you'll note that Republican senators have very little to say about that. Republicans don't have much to say about the cost of living, have done very little about the cost of living, have done nothing to stop or obstruct the administration's moves, such as tariffs, such as a war in Iran, that have exacerbated the cost of living crisis for tens of millions of Americans. Instead, they're wasting valuable time on hearings, relitigating stuff that most people don't want to think about anymore, and that only happens to be a particular obsession of right-wing freaks on X. That's it. All of this is staging for a handful of people on X, possibly a segment on Hannity.
That was me trying to be nice, Sean. The reality is this guy damaged a lot of things in this country.
As an aside, it'd be interesting to see Bernie Moreno bring that level of anger to the Republican House member who's been beating his daughter.
This is one of the most depraved bureaucrats in American history.
And I think this gets to something that's both important and undercovered, underconsidered, especially among mainstream commentators. You'll constantly find lots of discussion about the insularity of the American left wing. Whether or not that's true, it's a constant subject of discussion. You'll hear people constantly talk about how woke liberals are out of touch with ordinary Americans, a constant subject of discussion. But you won't hear anything similar about the extent to which the political right, the mainstream right, these are Republican senators, the mainstream right is consumed by a set of conspiracies and narratives that are really only relevant to a small and shrinking portion of the American public. There isn't some large clamoring for investigations against Fauci. This obsessiveness is the political equivalent of being entirely too online. And I actually think this is a broader problem within the American right. It is extremely insular. So much of what the right does and performs as a matter of politics is not for the typical voter, is not for people outside the American right. It's all for people who exist within the media and cultural universe of the right wing, for people who watch Fox and One America News Network, for people who listen to talk radio, who listen to the podcast, who watch the videos, all these things. It's all for a relatively small audience of people. And critically, because of the way primaries work, Republican politicians are exceptionally responsive to the small audience of people and to this larger media ecosystem, because if they aren't, they might lose their seats. They might lose the nomination to someone who is. And so what you have is this dynamic where Republicans are constantly performing a kind of opaque and baroque conspiracism for the purposes of appealing to a narrow segment of basically unhinged voters. And then they have to pivot to the mainstream to attempt to win general elections, and it makes it more difficult. Worse, the extent to which these voters are just not concerned with basic issues of governance means that these Republican politicians are not interested in basic questions of governance. The incentive structure for Republican politicians is geared entirely away from governance and towards these primaries and towards conservative media especially. That's all the more true when it's the case that if you are a Republican who loses your seat or you just get bored, you can get a talking head job on one of these networks. The conservative political world is intensely self-contained, and these Fauci hearings are such a great example of what that looks like. Obsessive, angry denunciation of an elderly bureaucrat, so that you can post the clips on X, see them on Fox News, get a couple donations, and be a little more secure as you approach your primary. And looming over all of this, of course, is Donald Trump, who demands that everyone perform for him. I'm going to do a video later about Trump's shockingly low numbers with the entire public, but for now, I'll say that if you're wondering why Republicans cannot pull out of this political tailspin that they're in, and they're in a political tailspin, it's because I think this dynamic, that the entire conservative universe is oriented away from the broad public and towards itself. And like any fandom that becomes intensely self-involved and self-obsessed, from the outside looking in, it seems like a bunch of freaks speaking nonsense.